crowd.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. All right.
So record to the cloud. That kind of sounds like speak to the hand.
Record to the cloud. Okay, well, Elena, do you think we should get going, or?
I do, and Kelly, I'll let you kick it off.
Yeah, okay, awesome. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We have been on travel, which we'll give you a brief update on, so it's nice that we're all back in the office, and nice to connect with you all today. So have a wild Halloween coming up next week. And here's the agenda, which I sent out in an email today. We'll talk a little bit about reprints and guide ordering for next year, NGSS correlations. We know y'all have been chiming in on those, so thank you for your input. Just give you a brief update about some of the travel we've been doing, and a welcome to a couple of new coordinators. And then today we're very excited to have a guest speaker, Bryant White. He's the program manager of trapping policy and Furbearer research at the association. So Bryant's going to share a little bit with us about his work, and then we'll wrap it up with questions, and that'll be it. Okay, Mark, are you there?
I am, yes.
All right, I'll hand it to you for that.
Okay, so I just wanted to give you all an update on where we're at with getting guides ready for the next printing. Aquatic Wild is at the printer, and they'll be finishing it up next week. Project Wild will be going to press very soon, and we are anticipating that the Aquatic Wild guides, this current printing of Aquatic Wild will be the 2019 edition. The Project Wild guide, probably printing will be finished in December, and it will be the 2020 edition. We're getting very low on inventory for both of those guides, so it's good timing, but those are up and coming. With the Project Wild guide, the terrestrial guide, there's relatively few changes, not very many maybe no noticeable differences really. Whereas the Aquatic Wild, there are noticeable differences, which we covered in the last monthly-ish webinar. We'll be giving you more information about price changes for 2020. That'll be perhaps on the next webinar. Kelly?
All right. Mark, you want to talk a little bit about the...
Oh, yes. Back to me. Okay, so thank you all for your input on your opinions about how we proceed with Project Wild and NGSS correlations. Many different opinions, but generally, as you might expect, those from NGSS states favored a more in-depth correlation. And for other reasons, that's what we're leaning towards, is to do something more in-depth, among other reasons, to help steer future content development for Project Wild. Thank you.
Okay, and so this is just a note that next year we're going to be encouraging y'all to place your orders by boxes of guides. It's more efficient, it saves on handling fees. So we'll give you the info with next year's order form, but Project Wild, for example, comes 8 to a box. Growing Up Wild comes 10 to a box, so that's pretty easy to remember. Aquatic Wild currently comes 12 to a box, but we'll lay that all out on next year's order form, but we just wanted to give you a heads up. That's what we're gonna ask y'all to do next year. We do have some flexibility with that, but we'd like to shift towards moving to ordering by complete boxes. All right, Elena.
Yes. So yesterday I returned from Japan, where Leanne and Susie and Jen Dennison and myself helped Hiroshi celebrate 20 years of Project Wild in Japan. So we were able to have one really great celebration. The second celebration, the symposium, was actually canceled because there was a typhoon that had come through. So the government shut down everything, including all transportation, and encouraged people to stay indoors during the typhoon. Go figure. Um, but I thought it was interesting that the World Rugby Cup thing was still going on. So they canceled a couple of the Saturday games, but I think Japan played that evening. They did not cancel that. Anyway, that was that. But Leanne did a great workshop for some folks the following week. And then Jen Dennison did a workshop, I think just like a regular Project Wild workshop, and did one Wild about bats, which they really enjoyed. There are lots of bats in Japan, and everything went great. The participants in Japan were very enthusiastic, super happy to learn about more about Project Wild. And I think it was great to have people from the US go over there to teach some of the workshops. They really enjoyed that. The picture in the bottom left corner is them learning about different animal noises.
Live right here, but the trees
I
were
thought
just
it
so
was really
beautiful. I had to
funny
take a picture.
when they learned about like how a cat sounds in the United States versus the sound that a cat makes in Japan. So great cross-cultural learning as well. So thanks. I'm sure Leanne, I see Leanne is on the line. Leanne, do you have anything to add? Oh, no, she just muted herself. She does not have anything to add at the moment, but we'll yeah.
There she is.
I was trying to unmute myself and apparently I muted myself. Thank
Okay.
you, Elena. I didn't hear all of what you said, but it was an amazing experience. And just to see the interest of Project Wild throughout Japan was really fun. And the cultural experience of experiencing Japan again in a more comfortable way was really wonderful for me. Thank you.
Yeah, and we'll put together, I think, more thorough synopsis for you all. Like I said, I just got back yesterday, so I'm getting a little sleepy right now, actually. And that's all for me.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Elena. And I just added a slide in here last week. Was that just last week? Oh my gosh, Mark and I were at the North American Association for Environmental Education Conference, and some other coordinators were there as well. Ashlyn from Kansas was there. Natalie from Michigan was there. Brittany from Kentucky was there. I think that's it. And we did a session. We did Quick Frozen Critters, and Brittany shared a little bit about their EE units that connect wild activities as well as others from Project WET and Project Learning Tree to the next generation science standards. And we had a booth as well. And so we made a lot of good connections, talked with some folks in your states. So it was a good conference. We have a couple of new coordinators. We have Lindsay from New Hampshire. And I see that Lindsay is on the call. Hello, Lindsay. If you can unmute yourself, do you want to say hi? I know it's a little, okay, she's okay, well, welcome. We're glad you're here. Thanks so much for jumping right on and into this webinar. And then Laura Craver-Rogers in Maine is taking over from Lisa Kane's position. So we're excited to have you both on board. Okay, Elena, I'll hand it over to you.
All right, thank you. So our guest today is Bryant White, and I'll introduce him in just a moment. But I wanted to set up what he's going to say with connecting it to Project Wild. So we don't have any activities that deal directly with trapping issues, but we do have activities that mention trapping or that deal with trapping as recreation or wildlife options, and they're listed there on your screen, so I won't go over all of them. Kelly, do you want to pull up the poll? Can you do that?
Oh, I think I can. Let me see. Poll. Oh, you know what, Elena? We're both logged in to the Project Wild account. So it's not going to let us do the polls.
Okay. So in the chat box, we have a question for you. So respond in the chat box. The first question is, do you mention or teach about or talk about trapping in your Project Wild workshops? So when you're doing a workshop or a presentation, does trapping come up at all during those workshops? Just a simple yes or no is fine. Sorry, Kelly, I didn't think about that.
Oh, yeah, no problem.
And so I'll give people another 30 seconds or so to find the chat box and respond. And just so you all know, the way that I find the chat box is I move my cursor around, and then down at the bottom or maybe the top of your screen, there's a little bubble that says chat. Okay, so I'm seeing a lot of no's. Kim has said, you know, it depends on what the focus is. Hazel has an emphatic yes, how she brings it up. And then, let's see, Julie says not currently, but probably will in the future. Okay, good to know. The second question is, are you comfortable talking about trapping in your workshops? And by comfortable, I mean, do you feel knowledgeable enough to talk about trapping in your workshops? So it's not necessarily comfort with regard to it, maybe it being a potential hot button issue, but comfort in terms of what you know about trapping. Yeah, and I see Kim, you know, had an interesting comment that she's comfortable because of her involvement with Conservation Leaders for Tomorrow. And I know that when Kelly and I spent, I think it was 5 days at Conservation Leaders for Tomorrow, trapping was a big part of the curriculum, where we spent a good portion of time learning about trapping. And yes, that was very, very helpful. I learned a lot. Oh, and Anita's doing CLFT in November. That's awesome. Can't wait to hear about it. And Rachel is working with the R3 coordinator to do a combined wild and R3 workshop. Rachel, we'll be getting in touch with you shortly. Okay. All right. So you can keep typing your responses in the chat box throughout, but Kelly, can we move on to the next slide?
Yes.
Okay, and here I'll introduce Bryant. So Bryant is a program manager of Furbearer research and trapping policy for AFWA, and he's been with AFWA since 2002. His primary responsibilities involve working with state and federal agencies and NGOs to develop best management practices for trapping in the US and to educate wildlife professionals about modern regulated trapping. He also works on issues related to human-wildlife conflict, prevention, and resolution. Bryant earned a BA in history from the University of Memphis, a master's degree in communication from Harding University, and a BS and MS in wildlife and Fisheries Science from Tennessee Technological University. And with that, Bryant, welcome and thank you for being a part of our webinar today.
Thank you, Elena, and I want to thank you and Kelly and Mark, all of you, for inviting me to kind of give you a presentation on the program that I manage for AFWA and trapping. But before I do that, I want to say I appreciate what you guys do too. I think Project Wild is a fantastic program, and I didn't realize that it was international, you know, that it was in Japan and maybe other countries. So that's really cool, and I want to congratulate you guys on the great work that you do. But and from the chat, I'm a CLFT instructor. I kind of helped CLFT develop their trapping module that they use as a part of that program. And I know further down the road, if you guys wanted to, you know, we could probably work together to develop some trapping modules as a part of Project Wild too. But as you guys know, trapping is something that's really, it's often misunderstood, it's often misrepresented, but modern regulated trapping is something that's really important in wildlife management. And I have, as Elena pointed out, spent about the last 20 years researching trapping, conducting field projects where we capture animals, somewhere around 400 different field projects that we've conducted in 41 states on 23 different species of animals. And I want to talk to you about that program. But before I do, it's kind of the last thing that I'm going to do. I want to give you some other information about trappers and trapping. So we're going to talk about some statistics and demographics on trappers in the U.S. We're also going to talk about how we use regulated trapping in wildlife management. And then I'm going to go into the best management practices for trapping program. And next slide, please. Is that the easiest way for us to do that? Just say next slide, or?
Yes, that works.
So, okay, and since trapping is kind of a controversial thing and sometimes misunderstood, one of the places where I generally like to start off is just letting folks know that there is a tremendous amount of support from trapping from the people who know the most about it. You guys are probably familiar with the Wildlife Society. The Wildlife Society is the professional organization for wildlife biologists. TWS has a standing position statement on trapping. It's very supportive of the use of traps and trapping in fur-bearer management, in wildlife management in the U.S. And if you went to their website and read that whole position statement, I know you can't read that, I can't either. But if you did, you'd also see that they mention our best management practices for trapping program, and they encourage people to consult BMPs before they participate in any trapping. So very supportive of trapping. Next slide, please. Another group that's supportive of trapping that has a position statement on it is the American Association of Wildlife Veterinarians. These are folks who probably know the most about injuries that animals might incur when they're captured in traps. And again, you could go to their website and read their position statement. Very supportive of the use of trapping in wildlife management. Next slide. The American Veterinary Medical Association, the AVMA, you'll notice that the first sentence of this paragraph, this is kind of their position statement on trapping. They oppose the use of conventional, which would be really a non-modified trap, a trap that's not padded or offset or has lamination, or there are a lot of different things that we can do to traps to make them more humane. They oppose the use of conventional steel jaw foothold traps. And one of the things that you're going to see as I'm giving you this presentation today when we get into the BMPs, essentially BMPs are opposed to those as well. We recommend that folks use highly modified, the most humane traps that are out there, and we've studied those and we know what those are. So we're kind of on the same page with the AVMA regarding that. You'll also notice they support its use in wildlife management, and the very last sentence of their position statement, they say anyone using traps should refer to AFWA's policy for best management practices for trapping in the U.S. So the AVMA is on board with our program and you know, recommends that folks consult what we've done before they participate in trapping. Yeah, go ahead to that next slide, Kelly. That's fine. AFWA, Of course, the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies has a number of resolutions on supporting trapping and its use in wildlife management and fur management. Next slide, please. And then one of the things that might surprise you, we've done a lot of surveys of the public about what they think about trapping and our use of it in wildlife management as wildlife managers. And we've done a number of studies over the years. The most recent one we did was in 2016, and we found that the majority, about 71% of the U.S. public supports regulated trapping. Only about 15% disapprove of it, and 75% of the folks out there believe that people should have the freedom to participate in this activity. So I guess where I was going with that is that there is a lot of support for trapping out there in the wildlife community. Biologists, wildlife professionals support it, veterinarians support it, the public supports it. And so I think a lot of times we hear things from various groups that have a bias toward trapping, but the truth is folks in the know really do support trapping and its use in wildlife management. So let's talk about trappers themselves for just a moment, the people who actually engage in this activity on a regular basis. I want to give you some, yeah, that's fine, Kelly. Go to that next slide. I want to give you some statistics on trappers compared to hunters, anglers, and wildlife watchers. We have done our own surveys, which I'm going to talk about to get this information, as opposed to, you're aware that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, every 5 years, they do a survey of hunters, anglers, and wildlife watchers. And so we do something sort of comparative to that, a little bit smaller scale and a lot less expensive. But they don't collect information on trappers when the Fish and Wildlife Service is doing their study. We're going to talk about what species are most sought after by trappers, what types of traps that they use, who participates in trapping and where they do it, and then what motivates folks to actually participate in trapping. Next slide. Where did this information come from? We conducted a survey of trappers in the U.S. in 1992 and 2004, and again in 2015. We used Gallup, the Gallup poll people the first time we did this survey, and then responsive management the last couple of times to gather a lot of information that we needed about trappers for our program. Next slide. So responsive management conducted the survey. We surveyed about 7,000 licensed trappers through our survey. And there's my dogs barking. I don't know if you can hear those, but I can. I was telling Kelly earlier that I have a rescue rabbit, a rescue cat, and 3 rescue dogs running around in my house somewhere, and the dogs were eventually going to bark, so that happened. 48 states participated in our survey. We didn't ask Hawaii to participate because they don't have regulated trapping. Certainly they trap mongoose and feral cats and other such things there in Hawaii, but really not what we would consider regulated trapping. And then there was one state in the Northeast, I think it was Rhode Island, Delaware, that couldn't give us their information. And the evaluation of that, if you were ever wanted to track that information down, these surveys are on our website, and that evaluation is at the national, regional, and by state level. So you can really break this information down in a lot of different ways. Next slide. If I get to going too fast, Kelly, let me know, okay? Just slow me down. So in 2015, there were about 176,000 licensed trappers. That was up from 2004, even up from 1992. And so, you know, while hunting numbers seem to be in the decline in various parts of the country anyway, trapping seems to be something that's not necessarily declining as much as hunting is. From a demographic perspective, most trappers are male. Average age is 48. None of that is surprising. One of the things that did concern us is that 90% of our trappers are over 24 years old, so we're not necessarily doing a great job recruiting new trappers in, and that's something obviously that we need to work on. We were doing a little bit better in 2015 than in 2004 when 97% were over 24 years of age. Next slide. Where are all these trappers? Most of them are in the Midwest, as you can see. Of the 176,000 or so trappers, 95,000 are in the Midwestern part of the U.S. And then you can see the other regions within the contiguous U.S. kind of fairly similar. The West and the Northeast have almost the same amount of trappers, same number of trappers, even though the West is much larger. Southeast, almost 30,000 trappers, and then Alaska, the fewest, which of course Alaska has the smallest population as well. And percentage-wise, there are more trappers in Alaska than elsewhere. Next slide. When we compare those numbers to hunting, angling, and wildlife watching, obviously there are a lot more hunters, anglers, and wildlife watchers. 11.5 million hunters in 2016, 35.8 million anglers, and 86 million wildlife watchers. And also look at the number of days that they participated in those activities: 16 days on average for hunters, 13 days on average for anglers. Next slide. Trappers are in the field a lot more. Trappers are very labor intensive. A lot of times if you're setting live restraint traps, you have to check those traps every day in the majority of states, and so it's pretty labor intensive. So on average, a trapper is out there about 36 days out of the year running the trap line, and 25% or almost 25% of trappers are out there 60 plus days. And so it's an activity that folks who do it really participate in it a lot, twice as much or more than those who hunt or fish. Next slide. We asked trappers what species they considered most important, what were the top 4 species that they were interested in capturing, and you can see that those numbers there: raccoon, coyote, muskrat, beaver, red fox, and bobcat, and most of those were up from 2004 in terms of what was of greatest interest to trappers. Next slide. You'll notice that there's quite a bit of regional variation in what was the most important species. In the West, it was bobcat; Midwest, raccoon; in the South, coyote; Northeast, red fox; and then Alaska, marten. You can see that coyote and raccoon and beaver appeared in almost every region, but the most important species was different by each region. So that tells us that there are a lot of different nuances to what's actually going on with trapping across the United States. Next slide. The most commonly used traps, most folks are using coil spring traps, body grip traps. There are other types of things out there that we've studied as a part of the BMP program that I'll mention, but these are the things that are most commonly being used. Next slide. Most trapping occurs on private land. That's not totally true when you look at the West or Alaska, where a lot more trapping does occur on public lands if you break that out regionally, but by and large across the whole U.S., 64% of that is occurring on private land, 25% mixed use, and then 11% use public land exclusively. Next slide. There are folks who want to talk about trapping in terms of it being really an income-generating thing for those who participate in it. It's really not. The average trapper makes about $1,600 a year from their effort, and if you look at that in terms of if you're putting in 36 days, 40 days of effort to generate that, you're making somewhere around $40, $45 a day. So it's not a real big income-generating thing for the folks who participate in that. You could certainly make more money driving for Uber or something like that. 78% of those who we asked about the income said that it was not at all important to them. So there are obviously other reasons that folks are participating in this activity. 20% said it was sort of a safety net for their family, and most of those were Western trappers rather than trappers anywhere else in the U.S. Next slide. So why do people do this? Well, we asked them that, and a number of other surveys that have been done as well, going all the way back to Stephen Tellert back in the 1970s, and probably most of you know who he is. The strongest reasons for participating in trapping were lifestyle orientation. Folks who trap generally also hunt, they fish, they're wildlife watchers, they collect mushrooms. They are people who really just enjoy the outdoors, and they're looking for a lot of different opportunities to get them out there doing things, and trapping is just one of the things that they participate in. nature appreciation. To be a trapper, you really have to appreciate nature. You have to understand a lot about an animal's ecology, where it spends its time, what it does, what it's doing at different times of the year. And so usually those folks who participate in trapping really appreciate nature. And then, of course, simply for wildlife management. There are a lot of different reasons that we trap animals for wildlife management. We're going to go into some of those in just a minute. But economic reasons were not a high motivation. Next slide. And so those are some of the references that I used to come up with that information. That stuff's out there, and obviously we can provide this presentation to you, and you can talk to me later if you'd like to. But next slide. Let's talk about regulated trapping in wildlife management, how we use it, because I know that's probably one of the things that you're concerned about. And so I came up with about 7 different things that we use trapping to do as a part of wildlife management here in the U.S. And we're going to talk about each one of these in a little bit more detail, but species restoration and protection is really critical. Monitoring animal populations is one of the things that agencies do with trapping. Population management, habitat management, relief from agriculture and property damage. I was reading a report from Wyoming Game and Fish just the other day, and they were saying they reimburse ranchers and farmers, you know, for property damage of some kind, and for wolf damage alone in Wyoming, they reimbursed ranchers right at $400,000 last year for just the damage of wolves. And so that's a really critical thing that we can use trapping for, to protect human health and safety. And then also, I think it's important to continue to value these fur-bearer resources under the North American model of wildlife management, because when we can't trap those, you know, through regulated trapping, they just become nuisance animals that we have to deal with in some other way. So, next slide. So in terms of restoration efforts, you're probably familiar with these stories. In fact, we published a couple of articles recently, folks that I work with in the Wildlife Professional. We did an article about river otter reintroduction, but wolves and Canada lynx, beaver, fisher, marten, snowshoe hare. There are a lot of other species as well that we have been able to capture those animals in areas where they're abundant, reintroduce them in other parts of the U.S. to establish new populations. And Kelly, I realized that this slide that I sent you is an old slide because North Dakota and New Mexico, which are the 2 states where it says river otter are extirpated, North Dakota has a burgeoning population of river otters now. In fact, they're trying to start a trapping season there, maybe this year or next year. And then also there are certainly otters in New Mexico as well. So otters are in every U.S. state doing well at this time, and that's a result of, you know, folks capturing them and kind of moving them around. A lot of these other species are as well. Canada lynx, a lot of discussion with the Fish and Wildlife Service about taking those off the endangered species list because their populations are doing well in a lot of places as well. So, of course, wolves have been off and on the endangered species list many, many times in many places. We also use trapping to protect a number of different species, and I think the next slide, don't go to that yet, Kelly, but there are a bunch of species that we use trapping to protect. But some of the more well-known and maybe more charismatic species, sea turtles, to protect their nests from predators. We trap raccoons and foxes to try to make sure there's a greater nesting success for them. Osprey, colonial nesting seabirds like that cute little Atlantic puffin, especially island nesting colonial seabirds. That can be a real critical issue with Arctic fox and other things. So, and whooping cranes. The folks at Aransas National Wildlife Refuge have pretty well assured us that whooping cranes would have gone extinct if they did not use trapping to protect them during the vulnerable nesting time and when they're raising their young, so due to predation. Next slide. Those are some of the other species that we use trapping to protect. Next slide. Another thing that agencies use trapping for is simple population monitoring. And so what agencies are generally do is that at the end of the trapping season each year, they require trappers to report their harvest and also to report their effort. And so a trapper is going to have to let the agency know what species they captured, how many of the various species they captured, where they captured those geographically, how much effort they put into the capture. And you can see that an agency over years and years of collecting that kind of information, we can get a lot of great trend data on populations. So we understand when a population is expanding or when it's declining. We can understand whether that population is actually growing or whether it's being reduced. Also, a lot of agencies collect carcasses, and they can use those carcasses to evaluate reproductive rates, to look at toxin loads, to look for diseases and parasites, and also by pulling teeth and things like that, they can look at the age structure and growth rate of the population. So those are some pretty critical things that agencies can do with trapping to gather information. And of course, if you're going to do a mark and recapture study, first of all, you got to capture the animal most of the time, and trapping is the way that that's typically done. Most animals are pretty fast and hard to catch otherwise. Population management is another thing, just maintaining populations at desired levels, moderating sort of population eruptions, reducing diseases, starvation, and malnutrition, kind of keeping animals at a carrying capacity, whatever that happens to be, mitigating habitat damage, and then resolving some human-wildlife conflicts when those come up. And so that picture of those raccoons in a dumpster was actually taken by the Missouri Department of Conservation photographers several years ago, and that dumpster's way above carrying capacity, I guarantee you that, but that's what can happen in certain situations. Next slide. You're probably aware of the nutria story. Nutria are all around the U.S. on the coast, whether it's the East Coast, the West Coast, or the down in Louisiana, Texas, that part of the coast as well. But nutria were introduced accidentally in the U.S. into the 1930s, or at least the original introduction was accidental. I think they were deliberately put in other places. But they're an exotic herbivore, semi-aquatic rodent. They have a very high reproductive rate, extremely destructive to tidal marsh habitats. And as you're probably aware, I know from things that you do with Project Wild, those tidal marshes are very fragile ecosystems. And so when we have too many nutria in a marsh, they can denude that. It causes a lot of nutrient loss, sediment reduction, and then the habitat that is supposed to be there for lots of other species of animals gets lost. They're also very bad for the fishery industry, just simply because of their damage to the marsh and the reproduction of other species in the marsh. So next slide. So there have been a lot of efforts to eradicate nutria from coastal marshes around the world, and this was, or around the U.S., and this is a picture from Maryland, I believe, where Wildlife Services was doing an eradication in a marsh, and you see kind of the before where nutria were present in the marsh, the destruction that they had done, and then after the eradication effort, the marsh was able to recuperate and recover and return. And so Wildlife Services, along with just regulated trappers, has been very involved in trying to control the nutria populations and really eradicate an exotic species. Next slide. We also use it to reduce human-wildlife conflicts, simply to protect public health and safety, to protect property, which a lot of times is livestock, agriculture, and then also simply infrastructure. Beavers, you know, from some of those pictures, beavers can build dams and flood roads. They clog culverts, which again can cause flooding. So there are a lot of different issues sometimes that animals can cause that we have to deal with, and trapping is one of the ways that we can do that. There's also a cultural carrying capacity. We know that, you know, folks like to see animals. They enjoy having animals on the landscape, but sometimes there are too many, and we have to deal with some of those resolutions. Next slide. So a couple of things about trapping. One of the concerns that sometimes folks have about trapping is that it causes species to become endangered. You remember the slide that I showed you a little bit earlier about the species that were most popular that trappers like to capture: raccoons, coyotes, beavers, red fox, muskrats. Generally, these populations are doing really well, and so the populations of animals that trappers are trapping are generally abundant. Trapping is also highly regulated. There are seasons where you can and can't trap. Of course, for some species, there are bag limits and quotas, restrictions on where, when, and what types of devices you can actually use. So it's a highly regulated activity. Those regulations are based on science and concern for safety and welfare of the animals, the animal populations, and also the public that might come in contact with those traps in some sort of ways. And one of the program that I'm going to talk to you about next is the BMP program. And one of the things BMPs have been able to do is really scientifically demonstrate that we can capture animals very humanely. Trapping is also rigorously enforced through its laws and regulations. We have about 10,000 conservation law enforcement officers here in the U.S. Every state has them, and so there's enforcement to the laws that are out there. Most states require education and licensing for folks to participate in regulated trapping, and then, of course, there are a lot of benefits to wildlife and the public. Next slide. So without trapping, wildlife managers couldn't adequately or economically monitor fur-bearer populations. Agencies couldn't undertake all those great restoration and protection programs that they have in place. They would have fewer options to really help the public, relieve the public from agricultural and property damage, and to protect human health and safety. And then, again, agencies couldn't ensure the continued use of these fur-bearer resources. We would unfortunately relegate a lot of these animals to simply nuisance species, and that's not a good thing, and really not in line with our North American model of wildlife management. Next slide. In spite of all that, though, trapping's still controversial, isn't it? How animals are treated, what they're used for, those are issues that are really important to the public. They're important to the scientific community. They're also important to the trapping community. And so the concern is that captured animals are injured by the traps that they're caught in, or that the traps are not selected. You set a trap out there and you might catch anything in it. Is that really true? And that's one of the things that we've tried to address through the BMP program. We need to be able to address those with science, not anecdotal information. And so that's what I've been doing really for the last 20 years. Thank you, Kelly. So the objectives of the program to develop best management practices for trapping is really to improve the welfare of wildlife captured by traps, to enhance the awareness and understanding of modern regulated trapping, and so doing things like this. And we have a workshop that we do for state fish and wildlife agencies. We've done over 100 workshops over the last 15 or so years, and educated about 6,000 wildlife professionals about trapping. And then just to sustain regulated trapping as a wildlife management technique, because state and federal agencies want us to do that so they can continue to use it for their scientific objectives. Next slide. And so there's a group of folks that I work with, the U.S. Furbearer Conservation Technical Work Group of AFWA. The folks who sit on that technical work group are from state conservation agencies, federal agencies, tribal agencies, and trappers associations. So we have kind of experts from a lot of different places that come together and sit on that group and help make decisions about what we're going to do through the BMP program. Next slide. So the way we have that set up within our technical work group, there's an ad hoc group for each of 23 different species of fur bearers. So each animal basically has its own group of experts that help develop a BMP document. And those group participants include the state and federal, sometimes tribal folks as well, and then invited experts who are generally from the trapping community who really know well how to capture these animals. Next slide. So developing a BMP, there are BMPs for everything, right? Not just trapping. There are BMPs in forestry, BMPs for collecting lead out of shooting ranges. There are BMPs for all kinds of things. And it's a pretty intuitive process. We look at the past data about trap performance and use, and when we started this program in 1997, there were already about 70 studies that had been done through the National Wildlife Research Center, primarily that's in Fort Collins, used to be in Denver at the time. There was already quite a bit of research out there that we could start to gather information from. We identified our research priorities about what fur-bearer species were most important to trappers, what trap types were most important to trappers and agencies through the various surveys that we did. We conduct field projects every year. We started back in 1997. We capture animals and necropsy those animals. And then we have a lot of data to evaluate from the field, from the trappers themselves. And then we compare the performance of those traps to an international standard. And then we synthesize all that data and experiences to produce a trapping BMP. Next slide. So there are 23 different species that we're going to develop BMPs for, and if you count the number of animals on there, there's really only 22, so I left one off that slide somehow, and it's probably the only one left, and that is wolverine. So we have a BMP for all of the species that are listed on this slide. The only species we don't have a BMP for at this time is wolverine, and I do have a research project going in Alaska this year where we're capturing wolverines, and I think within the next year or two we'll have a BMP for wolverines as well. And those are available on our website and lots of other places around as well. In terms of the traps that we've tested and continue to test, pretty much anything that could be used to capture an animal. Live restraint systems, and also lethal systems. But in terms of live restraint, foothold traps, foot encapsulating traps, which we're going to talk about a little bit more, cage and box traps, and then cable restraints, and then lethal systems, which are body grip traps and killing snares. Next slide. So there are a lot of different ways that we can modify a what we call just your basic foothold trap. Some people refer to it sometimes as a leg hold trap, but it's really a foothold trap. These traps are designed to catch animals by their foot, not their leg. We can pad the jaws. That's going to make it more humane, or at least we found that through our research. Next slide. We can offset the jaws, which again is going to make the trap more humane, less clamping force on the animal's foot once the trap is sprung shut on it. Next slide. Lamination is another thing that we can do, which basically we're welding a bar to the trap jaw, either above it or below it, or perhaps above and below, increasing the surface that's actually in contact with the animal's foot is probably one of the best things that we found to make traps more humane, reduce injury. Next slide. Double jaws is primarily used when we're capturing raccoons. It prevents raccoons have a tendency to want to chew on their toes when they're captured in this type of trap, and when we use double jaws, it essentially prevents them from doing that. Next slide. Using swivels in the chain is really critical. Next slide. And then also having a shock spring in the as a part of the chaining system is really critical as well. Next slide. These are foot encapsulating traps, which are designed to capture raccoons fairly specifically. Not too many other species that you can capture with these, maybe a possum occasionally. Also, I understand that these are used in Asia to capture monkeys, but they're specifically designed to capture raccoons. Sometimes trappers refer to these as dog-proof traps because dogs, the entrance, the opening into the trap itself is only about 1.5 inches in diameter, so most dogs can't get their feet in there and they couldn't get caught in these traps. But raccoons, their paws are small enough to reach in there. They have to grab a trigger and pull that trigger, so they have to have quite a bit of manual dexterity, and dogs, again, wouldn't have the ability to do that, but raccoons do. So, next slide. The typical cage trap, you guys are familiar with those, I'm sure. They work great for some species. Other species, they don't work very well. Certain species won't even go into a cage trap to be captured. So they work great for some things, but not for everything, certainly. Next slide. Cable restraint devices. We can catch an animal around the neck or by the foot with one of these, and we found that, at least in terms of capturing canids and beavers, they work really well, and clearly the most humane device out there for capturing a coyote is the cable restraint around the neck. Next slide. Body grip traps, which are lethal, designed to be lethal. We've tested those as well, and I'll go into some of that a little bit later as well. Next slide. So in terms of how we evaluate the welfare of traps, I know I'm probably running short on time, so I'll run through this pretty quickly. But for a trap to be recommended through the BMP program, there are 5 different criteria that we use to evaluate the trap. The first one is animal welfare, the second efficiency, third selectivity, safety, and practicality. And so in order for a trap to be a BMP trap, it has to meet the criteria that we have established for all of these different standards that we have. In terms of animal welfare, pop back to that slide for just a second, Kelly. In terms of animal welfare, the standard that we use was developed by the International Organization of Standardization, or what we generally refer to as ISO. ISO is probably the most authoritative standard-setting body in the world. And the way that we participated in the ISO process in the United States is through the American National Standards Institute, or what we call ANSI, which you've probably heard of them as well. We developed a technical advisory group within ANSI that was made up of biologists and veterinarians, trappers, animal rights advocates. We had really a good, diverse group of people that we put together for the U.S. participation. There were also folks from the UK, the EU, Canada, Russia, New Zealand, Australia, from all over the world that were participating in this process as well, with their biologists and their veterinarians. And so we had a very robust and diverse group to put these together. And so we followed the guidelines that were set by ISO with the protocols of our field testing, and then the evaluation of the animals, the injury to the animals that we capture, or in terms of traps that are set to kill animals, how quickly those traps kill the animals. We follow those protocols, and this kind of trap testing is done in a lot of other countries as well. And we partner with other countries, and we exchange data with other countries on a pretty regular basis. So, next slide. So in terms of animal welfare, there are 2 different things that we look at for restraining traps, and a trap has to meet both of these different criteria in order to pass the animal welfare standard. We look at an average cumulative injury score that has to be less than or equal to 55 points on that ISO scale, and I'll explain that in a little more detail. And then at least 70% of the animals must have no injuries described as being moderately severe or severe on that ISO scale, and I'll go into that a little bit more. But the reason that we decided on those 2 parameters in terms of animal welfare is because it was believed by the wildlife veterinarians and the biologists that participated in this from all over the world that that level of injury would not impair the ability of an animal to survive if it was released back into the wild. That animal would be able to continue to do whatever it does to survive without that being impeded. Next slide.
And right, and Bryant, we just have about 5 minutes, so just so you can know.
Oh, we do? Okay. Well, I'll tell you what. You're going to have to read the ISO document. I'll have to skip the specifics of the scale. So go to the next. I'm sorry about that, but I'm pretty passionate about this, and I talk too long. So sorry.
No problem.
All right.
Tell me
let's
when.
keep going.
Okay.
All right. So lethal traps, according to the ISO standard, they have to cause irreversible loss of consciousness and sensibility leading to death within 300 seconds in at least 70% of the animals in the sample. There's a compound in Canada where we do all of that testing. We partner with them on that, and that's where we get those results from. Next slide. Efficiency has to be at least 60%, so we want to make sure the animals, that the traps we recommend can actually catch animals. That's important. Next slide. And then we evaluate these three other things, not in a quantitative sort of way, but in a qualitative sort of way through a panel of experts, essentially, that look at the safety, the practicality, and the selectivity. So a trap has to meet all of those 5 criteria in order to be recommended through the BMP program. Next slide. And I'm going to go through this quickly. So we do our testing during the regulated trapping season so that we find out how traps really perform on the trap line when folks are using them. Next slide. We test traps across all U.S. regions. Next slide. So whenever we're testing a particular trap, we'll test it in a number of different regions at the same time for the same species, obviously with different trappers, so we get a good idea of how that trap performs across the U.S. in different climatic conditions, different soil types, so we can capture all those things. Sometimes it's a little chaotic noise, but we try to filter all that out to make sure our data is really good. Next slide. We use volunteer trappers to conduct trapping on their usual trap lines. Next slide. A technician accompanies the trapper and records all the data that we need. The trapper's job is to catch the animals. The technician's job is to capture all the data that we need as a part of that project. Next slide. The animals are shipped to various labs around the country. We use the one in Madison, Wisconsin a lot to collect all of our animals there, and then we will usually have 4 or 5 veterinarians come in each year, wildlife veterinarians from different state agencies that have been trained in this process to do those necropsies on the animals for us so we can properly evaluate the injuries. Next slide. And so a trapping BMP, these are on our website. They give you some biological information, details about the traps that we tested, and if we did anything particular that we thought was unique in our trapping effort, we let folks know that they should do those things if they're going to use the traps. Next slide. We're implementing BMPs in the U.S. through a voluntary education sort of approach. Next slide. We have an online trapper education course that was developed to specifically train people how to trap, but also to educate folks about best management practices for trapping. And so a lot of states use our website to educate their trappers and certify them. Next slide. And so since 1997, we've tested over 600 trap types, about 400 individual projects. One of the things that I think is important to point out is that less than 4% of all of our captures were cats or dogs, so we can set traps very selectively, and there are a lot of ways to do that. And we participated in efforts all across the U.S. Next slide. And I think that's pretty much the end. If you're interested in seeing more about the BMPs, they're on our website. We have 2 different websites that deal with all things Furbearer management. One is the AFWA website. There's a page, but this furbearermanagement.com website, everything Furbearer management there, the BMPs, and all kinds of other good information as well if you're looking for stuff on trapping. So I talked too long, so thank you, Kelly, Mark, and Elena, and I'll stop now. If anybody has a question, I'll try to answer it. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bryant. We really appreciate you sharing. You have such a wealth of knowledge about this. And I will pause. I know it's 2:30, so if you have to sign off, we totally understand. For any of you who do have questions and want to share those, now's your chance.
Well, there
I
was
can stay on here.
Yeah, there was a question from Ruth Ann about, activities, specific Project Wild activities that might deal with the trapping message. And Kelly's pulled up that slide right now. Again, these activities don't directly deal with trapping per se, but they do mention trapping. as either a management or recreational option. So we could definitely do a better job in communicating that trapping message. And you know, a lot of people early on in this webinar mentioned that they weren't exactly comfortable teaching or talking about trapping because they weren't very knowledgeable. And so hopefully after this, you have just a little bit more understanding about trapping and why it's used and how it's used. But Bryant, are there other places that they could go to find resources, and just trying to think about how we can continue to support our state coordinators in terms of communicating the appropriate trapping message?
Yeah, so the main thing that I would point you to is our website, our furbearmanagement.com website. There's a tremendous amount of information on there about fur management and trapping, and one of the pages is really specifically devoted to all the surveys and research and publications that we've done on trapping. We haven't necessarily developed anything that might, you know, that Project Wild could just take over, but I think there's a lot of information there that you guys could pull out to develop something, or that I would be glad to help you, you know, develop from the knowledge that I have and the resources that we have there on that website. So,
Okay,
but definitely
great.
check that website out.
Thank you. Let's see. Any other questions for Bryant at the moment? So, Bryant, we do have a listserv where people, the coordinators that participate on this webinar, frequently have discussions with one another. And so I will be sure to let you know if anyone, maybe later on, or if they weren't able to participate in the webinar today, people watch it later and they may have questions. So I'll be sure to let you know if anything else comes up.
Okay, sounds great.
And
Bryant, is that online course free to take, or is there a fee associated with it?
It is.
It's free?
It's free to take, and most states will accept that course for trapper certification. There are some states that use it exclusively. There are other states that they may have their own program, but they also recognize the AFWA program. And so it's a basic trapper education course, but one of the things that we built into it specifically was education about BMPs, because we want to encourage trappers to use the most humane traps, you know, in their efforts. So, but it is free, absolutely.
Great. I'll be sure to send that link out as well.
Okay, yeah, it's a good place to start building your knowledge about trapping for sure.
Great. Okay, Mark or Kelly, anything else that I'm forgetting about?
No, nothing else from me.
Okay. All right, well, with that, we want to thank you all for joining us today, and special thanks to Bryant for joining us and spreading his wealth of knowledge as well as passion about trapping. So Bryant, thank you so much. We really do appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate the invitation. I enjoyed it.
All right, thanks everyone. We'll talk to you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.